everyone again. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today as we chat about how to learn temporal. My name is Kelly. I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, just going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First off, we will have a Q&A session with our wonderful speakers at the end of the presentation. Please add your questions to the Q&A queue, and we will get those answered at the end. And second, we are recording today's session. So please feel free to revisit this content and reshare with your friends and colleagues when we share that with you all. So like I said, we're going to be talking about how to learn temporal. What better way to learn than from our wonderful education team here at Temporal. So I'm going to kick it off with some intros here and start with Tom Wheeler. Tom, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. I'm Tom. I'm a principal curriculum developer on Temporal's education team, which is the team that's responsible for training and documentation. I started at Temporal about 2.5 years ago, and I'm joined today by two others from the same team, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Alex.
Thanks, Tom. I'm Alex Garnett. I am a senior curriculum developer at Temporal. I work on our Python and Go courses, and I came to Temporal about a year ago. Angela, next to you.
Thanks, Alex. I am also a senior curriculum developer, and I work on the documentation and courses mainly in TypeScript. And I also came to Temporal about a year ago.
All right. Thanks, Angela. Well, in today's session, we're going to introduce you to the wealth of resources that are available for learning temporal, along with some tips and some advice about how to use them. We'll explore the documentation, tutorials, training courses, sample code, and a few other things. So there's a lot to cover today, and let's just get started with it. But first, I want to mention Replay, which takes place near Seattle in less than 2 months. I've attended the previous ones, and I can tell you that there's no better place to learn temporal than at this conference. It has keynotes from our founders, technical sessions from our engineers, and most importantly, tons of presentations from other companies who are using temporal for a variety of use cases. The other thing it has is a full day of hands-on workshops. Alex, Angela, and I, along with 4 other instructors, will be teaching those. We hope to see you there. As a thank you to those attending today, we've got a promo code, webinar20, that will get you a 20% discount on your tickets. So go ahead and scan the QR code or head on over to replay.temporal.io and you can join us. Tickets are selling quickly, but there's still time to get yours. All right, let's get started with the documentation. Temporal has extensive documentation, and even though I'd imagine that most of you have already seen it, I think this is a great place to begin because I've got some tips that can help you find the information you need when you need it. You can find our documentation by following the docs link at the top of Temporal's homepage. You can also go directly to the documentation by entering docs.temporal.io into your browser's address bar. Here's the front page of the documentation. As you'll notice on the sidebar, it's organized into sections such as evaluate, develop, deploy to production, and reference. These sections reflect the information architecture work that our team has done in the past year to arrange this information so that you can find what you need during each phase of your journey with Temporal. Let me briefly cover each of these sections I just named. We'll start with evaluate. Next slide, please. Whoops, I'm sorry, previous slide. I jumped the gun there. So the first one is evaluate, and it's aimed at helping you determine what temporal is and the features that it provides. Ultimately, it's about helping you determine whether it's a good fit for the problems you need to solve. The next one is helpful to you once you decide to build an application with temporal. Whether that's a small proof of concept for a demonstration or a big application that you're going to deploy to production, you'll need to know how to use the different features provided by your chosen SDK. As you can see on the left, there are guides for each of our SDKs. I've expanded the one for .NET here just to give you an idea of the content, but there's a similar guide for every other SDK that we offer. I want to take a quick detour here before I go on to the next section. In addition to the feature guides I just showed you, there's also API documentation, which is written by our SDK engineers. If you go to the top level page for develop in the documentation, you'll see links to the API reference documentation for each SDK. I've highlighted them here. Here's an example of what I mean by API documentation, and I'm using the example for the Go SDK. This is published to a location that's idiomatic for that language in a format that's idiomatic for that language. For example, the documentation for the Go SDK uses the GoDoc format, and it's published to package.go.dev, which is a standard for that language. Conversely, the Java SDK publishes API documentation in JavaDoc format, and it's published to the javadoc.io site. All right, that's it for my detour. Let's continue talking about the next part of our documentation. The next step after you develop an application is to deploy it. And this section of the documentation covers that. Whether you're self-hosting the Temporal server software or using Temporal Cloud, you'll find the guidance you need here. There's also a section with details on how to migrate from a self-hosted deployment to Temporal Cloud. That brings us to the last section, reference. In this section, you'll find pages that you'll find yourself referring back to no matter how much experience you gain. If you've ever seen the event history for a workflow execution, you'll know that there's a lot of information there. Well, there's a section in the reference that provides all the details you need to understand it. It lists every type of event and every single attribute that each one of them contains. I actually included the troubleshooting, encyclopedia, and glossary sections in the highlighted area because I consider them to be reference material too. And that's really the main role of our documentation, is to serve as a reference and give you the detailed technical information you need when you need it. The only problem is sometimes you can't find it. Despite all the hard work we've put into organizing the information, there may still be times where you don't know how to find something. That's a problem that our search feature can solve for you. You just click the search box near the upper right corner of the page. That's going to pop up a box where you can enter your search term, and it'll filter the results as you type. Let me offer you a tip. Temporal has multiple SDKs. Each one has its own documentation, but the chances are you're only going to be interested in results for the specific SDK you're using at any given point in time. In that case, you can use a prefix, like I've shown here, to limit the results to that SDK. Now, I don't know if this is officially supported, but it's something that I discovered a long time ago, and I've been using it ever since. Search is great if you know the keyword to look for, but that's not always the case. A lot of times, and especially when you're just getting started, you just have a question and you're looking for an answer. That's where the Ask AI feature in the documentation can help you. You just click the Ask AI icon in the lower right corner of the page. That pops up a box where you can enter the question, such as, what's the difference between a child workflow and an activity? It thinks for a moment, and then it begins typing out an answer. I'll caution you that, like any other AI tool, it's not 100% perfect, but it's a lot better than most. The best part is that below the answer, it cites its sources, so you can read up more about it directly. Now that we've covered the documentation, let's continue with another valuable resource, tutorials. Tutorials are just one of many things that we offer at the Temporal Learning Center. You can access that site directly at learn.temporal.io, or if you're coming from the documentation, you can just click the Start Learning link in the header. There are two types of tutorials, the intro level ones that help you get started and the more advanced ones where you work through a project. I'll cover them both. The Getting Started tutorials are where you'll take your first steps with Temporal, using the language that corresponds to the SDK you want to use. We strongly recommend completing these in the order presented. Each begins with a quick 5-minute tutorial that covers how to install the tools you'll use to develop and run Temporal applications. You should then follow that with the Run Your First Application tutorial, during which you'll have the opportunity to run an existing Temporal application and validate that your setup works correctly. You'll also explore the code, which means that you'll learn about some essential parts of Temporal applications, such as workers, workflows, activities, and retry policies. Most of our SDKs have additional Getting Started tutorials that follow those two. For example, guiding you through the process of writing your own application from scratch, or having your workers use Temporal Cloud instead of a temporal service that's running on your own local machine. After you complete the Getting Started tutorials, you may wish to continue with a project-based tutorials, which build on what you've learned and show you how to implement a given use case with Temporal. These tutorials vary based on the SDK, but some examples include creating an email subscription service, managing a trip booking with a saga pattern, and building a data pipeline. A few of these tutorials are older, but we've made updating them a priority, and this has been an area of active development for the temporal education team so far this summer. In fact, we've already updated at least 8 tutorials this summer, and we have more than a dozen active projects for additional updates, as well as brand new tutorials. Another thing that you'll find on the learn.temporal.io site is a list of our training courses. The tutorials are a great way to learn the basics, but if you're looking for a more guided, in-depth learning experience, I'd recommend our free self-paced online training. We currently offer 6 courses, and in them, you'll find helpful explanations, code walkthroughs that will help you to understand interactions between different parts of the system, video-based demonstrations, and hands-on exercises where you can practice what you've learned. And speaking of hands-on exercises, our courses provide a browser-based environment for working on them, so there's nothing to install and no cost to you. This is provided through a service called GitPod. To use it, you click a link provided in the training course and authenticate with GitHub. This will launch a web-based IDE right in your browser, and that provides the source code for hands-on exercises, Visual Studio Code for editing the source code, terminals for executing command, a private temporal cluster for your applications, and an embedded web browser so you can use the Temporal Web UI. We provide this browser-based exercise environment as a convenience since we realize that someone just starting to explore Temporal may be unable to install the development tools locally on a machine they use for work. Each course also provides instructions for local setup too, so you can do all of the hands-on exercises directly on your machine if that's what you prefer. I'll now turn it over to Angela to talk about Temporal 101.
Thanks, Tom. It's actually me this
Sorry,
time,
Alex.
but that's okay.
My mistake.
Same letter. Anyway, our first course is Temporal 101, Introducing the Temporal Platform. We recommend everyone new to Temporal begin with Temporal 101. Like all of our courses, it's available for free, self-paced, online. We also deliver it live several times a year, both online and in person at our replay conference. You can find it at the top of the courses list on our learning site. I'll now provide a quick overview of what you'll learn in Temporal 101. During this course, you'll learn the basic architecture of the temporal platform, develop and execute workflows and activities using a temporal SDK, use the web UI to gain insight into current and previous executions, experiment with failures and retries, and understand how a temporal service orchestrates execution. In Temporal 101, you'll learn about the architecture of the temporal server. The temporal server is comprised of several backend services, each of which are horizontally scalable for growing deployments. They're accessible through a front-end service, which allows temporal clients to connect using a gRPC API. There are 3 types of temporal client that you'll become familiar with in Temporal 101. The temporal web UI, temporal SDK code, which is, in other words, your own apps, and the temporal command line app. Let's take a look at some sample temporal command line usage. The temporal CLI can be used to retrieve information on all of the workflow and activity executions that have been tracked by the temporal server. Each event logged by a temporal application is appended to a read-only event history on the server side. In Temporal 101, you'll run some basic workflows and activities to see an example of the event history that they generate. The temporal CLI can also be used to retrieve output from a given workflow, or to retrieve more detailed information about any failures, retries, and so on. Of course, it may not always make sense to query your workflows one at a time using the CLI. In this case, you can use the temporal web UI, which is available in a browser alongside a running temporal service. The temporal web UI provides a detailed view into each of your workflow's execution details, input, and output. It also provides a timeline view showing the order of events in your event history, so you can identify bottlenecks or visualize activities that were retried multiple times before successfully completing. You can also use the web UI or the CLI to run queries on your workflows. Temporal 101 provides several opportunities to experiment with the temporal web UI. Finally, you learn a bit about how to configure Temporal for your needs. As you may know by now, Temporal provides durable execution by gracefully handling activity failures, enabling them to retry when they encounter certain failure conditions. Temporal provides its own default logic for how and when activities are retried, called a retry policy. A retry policy includes several components, such as a backoff coefficient and a maximum number of attempts. In Temporal 101, you'll experiment with activity retries and learn how to customize your retry policies. That's it for Temporal 101. Next, my colleague Angela will tell you what you'll learn in Temporal 102.
Thanks, Alex. So just like Temporal 102, you can access it on learn.temporal.io, and it's also self-paced, free, and takes about an estimation of 4 hours. And in this course, you'll build on what you learned in Temporal 101 and go beyond the basics of temporal application development. So our goal of this course is to equip you with the skills necessary to use temporal effectively throughout the development lifecycle. You'll learn strategies on how to test, debug, as well as deploy your application and deepen your understanding of how temporal works in general. As you can see on the left side, we have our current 102 courses available in the Go, Java, Python, TypeScript SDK. And just like with 101, you don't need to be an expert in whatever SDK language you're choosing, but the code is a bit more complex than the one in Temporal 101. During this course, you will evaluate how the temporal platform achieves durable execution, apply best practices for temporal application development, analyze an event history to debug problems with workflow execution, and prepare for using temporal in a production environment. One of the main parts of Temporal 102 is to look at ways that you can improve your temporal application code with best practices. In Temporal 101, you built basic workflows and activities, and you focused on understanding important foundational concepts. But in Temporal 102, you'll learn more about best practices and how to write code that's easier to maintain. For example, one best practice we recommend is to use an object or struct, depending on what SDK you're using, as your input parameters and return values in order to maintain backwards compatibility. So by using objects, code is better able to handle future evolution of the input or output data. In Temporal 102, you'll also dive deeper into workflow execution states in order to better understand how to interpret the workflow execution event history. So for example, understanding the states of your workflow tasks can help you better determine the source of a problem if you run into one when running a workflow. For example, if the workflow execution ended with a status of failed, then you know that the workflow function returned an error. In fact, the final event in the history for that workflow execution will contain information about that error, which is conveniently shown in the web UI. Speaking of event history, you'll also have plenty of videos where you can step through the event history code line by line to understand how API calls in your code map to commands issued to the temporal service, as well as how those commands map to events persisted in the history of a workflow execution. This helps developers to deeper understanding the lifecycle of a workflow. This mapping is very important for debugging and optimizing workflows, as it shows exactly how actions in the code impact the workflow state and history. Then you'll learn about the logical view of an application with a production system using temporal. For example, on the left, we have multiple worker processes, which we can refer to as a worker fleet. And these workers run on infrastructures that you manage, which can take many forms, like physical services in your data center, virtual machines, or containers inside a Kubernetes cluster. On the right side of the connection is a temporal service or temporal cloud. So you'll learn how to configure this for deployment and how to view this in a production sense. As you learn more about deployment, you'll also learn about temporal specific errors that you can get. For example, as you can see here, deploying changes to a running workflow definition can have the potential to cause non-deterministic errors. That's what our next course is about, versioning workflows. Passing it to Al.
Thanks, Angela. In versioning workflows, you'll learn how to track changes to your temporal applications, as well as how to safely deploy those changes in production and run multiple versions of your temporal application code side by side. I'll provide a quick overview of what you'll learn in versioning workflows. During this course, you will apply an appropriate versioning strategy to modify your workflows, understand which types of changes can safely be deployed without versioning, distinguish between the supported versioning implementations, implement a versioned workflow, and verify correct implementations of versioning strategies. As you'll have learned in Temporal 102, versioning temporal application code is necessary because temporal workflows need to be deterministic. This means that under normal circumstances, rerunning the same workflow should produce the same result as any other run. Any non-deterministic behavior normally belongs in your activities. When you need to change your workflow code, the temporal service needs to understand and store it as a different logic branch. This is where versioning comes into play. In our versioning course, you'll learn all about how Temporal tracks and manages these revisions. When you create multiple revisions of your workflow code, a search attribute is added to Temporal's database that allows you to filter by each of those revisions. This way, you can track different versions that are running in parallel in case you need to migrate to a newer code path or collect metrics from different revisions. Our versioning course goes into more detail here. That's it for versioning for now. Next, back to Angela, who will tell you what you'll learn in our Interacting with Workflows course.
Thanks, Alex. So our next free course, Interacting with Workflows, is a bit more advanced than the 101 and 102 courses. And so it requires 101 and 102 as prerequisites. Like all our other courses, it's self-paced, free, takes about 3 hours. This course will cover how to interact with workflows that are able to respond to external events, such as cancellations, having an external event change the workflow execution flow, make your application more dynamic, and so on. Just like with our other courses, you can see on the left side, we have our current Interacting with Workflow courses available with the Go, Java, Python, and TypeScript SDK. As always, you don't need to be an expert in whatever SDK language you're choosing, although the code is, again, more complex than the ones in 101 and 102. During this course, you will define and handle signals and queries, send signals and queries to workflows, set custom search attributes and query for them, cancel workflow through the web UI, command line, and SDK, and asynchronously complete an activity. One big part of this course is understanding how to use signals. Signals allow users to send a message to a running workflow execution and change its state and control the flow. For example, in an order application, a signal might be someone canceling the order or updating the order because that changes the flow and next steps of the workflow execution and allow the workflow execution to react to these external events. You'll learn how to define your signals, write the logic to handle them, and how to send signals through the client command line, or how to send a signal from one workflow execution to another. You'll learn about common problems that people have with signals in a production sense, workarounds, and best practices. And you'll also be able to practice what you learned with hands-on exercises that showcase different ways to send signals. You'll also learn about queries, which allow you to expose the internal state of a workflow execution or individual details about that workflow execution to the external world. For example, if you have a subscription workflow, you can get details on the customer, total amount charged, subscription details, and more without disrupting the ongoing workflow execution, but giving you more insight into the current state and details of that workflow execution. You'll also learn about search attributes, which are used to organize and access workflow executions efficiently. For example, if you have millions of workflow executions going on, how would you quickly search for a list of workflow executions that have failed? And even though Temporal has default search attributes like the workflow type or execution status, sometimes you want to set your own custom search attributes like the order date or customer ID. This course will show you how to set your own custom search attributes using multiple different ways. And our course includes a demo that walks you through this process step by step. You'll also learn how to cancel a workflow execution. For example, if someone cancels an online order, you'd want to cancel that particular workflow execution gracefully, meaning issuing cleanup tasks like issuing refunds, restoring stock inventory, and more. You'll learn different ways to cancel workflow execution, as you can see on the slide, with your command line, search attributes with the SDK, and more. You'll learn when it's appropriate to cancel workflow execution and when it's appropriate to terminate one, which is a less graceful way to stop your workflow execution. You'll also learn different cancellation patterns that you can use in your production code. Last but not least, the course covers asynchronous activity completion. This covers the scenario of if a task takes a long time or is hosted on an external system, how would Temporal handle this? For example, in a video processing system, imagine an activity that involves uploading a large video file to a cloud service. The activity immediately returns after starting the external upload process, even though the upload is still happening in the background. Once the video is successfully uploaded, the external process signals the completion of the activity back to the temporal service. We won't get into the details this time. Of course, in addition to learning how to write dynamic workflows, it's also just as important to write secure workflows. That's where our next course comes into play, and Alex will talk about.
Thanks, Angela. Our next course is securing application data. In this course, you'll learn how to use Temporal with encryption to protect data being sent to the Temporal service. I'll provide a quick overview of what you'll learn in securing application data. During this course, you will apply an appropriate authentication and encryption strategy, implement a custom data converter, deploy and integrate a codec server with a temporal cluster, display decoded output in the temporal web UI and CLI, and establish ingress and access configurations for a codec server. When you send encoded input payloads to a temporal workflow, they remain encoded on the server side, meaning that temporal never actually sees the decoded data. This means that if you look up those workflows using the CLI or web UI, you'll receive some metadata about the encoding, but you won't actually receive the decoded output by default. The payloads are returned encoded. To decode your payloads on the fly, you can configure a temporal codec server. Both the CLI and the web UI are able to pass results to a codec server at runtime so they can be automatically decoded locally or in a secure environment without any chance of leaking data. You can learn about codec servers in the Securing Application Data course. Temporal is agnostic as to which codecs you implement. It doesn't have a built-in concept of encryption. It only knows whether payloads are encoded or not. This way, you can integrate it into your local infrastructure using your own encryption key management system and your preferred encryption libraries. That's it for securing application data. Next, back to Tom, who will tell you what you'll learn in our introduction to Temporal Cloud.
Thanks, Alex. Introduction to Temporal Cloud is a 1-hour self-paced course that's designed for people who already have a basic understanding of Temporal, but they're new to Temporal Cloud. It's intended for onboarding, and it begins by explaining the role of Temporal Cloud and differentiating it from a self-hosted deployment. It then begins a tour of the Temporal Cloud UI, so you'll know how to navigate the system and find the tools you need. From there, it demonstrates how to set up a new Temporal Cloud account, starting with how to set up a namespace, invite new users into the account and assign them to namespaces, and establish roles and permissions that govern what they're authorized to do after they log in. Finally, it demonstrates how to create an endpoint for a third-party observability tool and how to view usage information, both for the entire account and for a specific namespace. Unlike the other 5 courses that Alex and Angela described, this one does not involve writing code, and there's no hands-on exercises. A lot of times people wonder, well, there's so many courses here, what should we take? What order should we take them in? And I want to address that now. I recommend that everyone begin here with the Temporal 101 course. As Alex described, it's a solid introduction to the Temporal platform, and it provides foundational knowledge that will help you with every other course that follows. Our goal in designing this course was that a developer could learn in just a couple of hours what would typically take someone a couple of weeks to figure out by themselves. Next, I strongly recommend following that up with Temporal 102. As Angela explained, this course goes beyond helping you to understand what Temporal does. It's a course that will help you to understand how Temporal works, and it provides particular focus on durable execution. This is essential for understanding how to develop, support, and maintain applications in production, and it's going to help you correctly answer questions like, will this update break backwards compatibility with existing workflow executions? Or do I need to use versioning in order to safely deploy this change? Additionally, this course will help you to recognize and fix several problems developers often face. While our goal with Temporal 101 was to save you 2 weeks of trying to learn the platform on your own, the goal for Temporal 102 was to build on that knowledge and save you a couple of months. So to recap, we recommend that everyone begins with 101, continues on by completing Temporal 102, but we currently offer 4 other courses. As I explained a moment ago, the Introduction to Temporal Cloud course is different from the others because it doesn't involve code and therefore isn't specific to any particular programming language or SDK. The others, versioning workflows, interacting with workflows, and securing application data, all establish Temporal 102 as a prerequisite, which in turn establishes Temporal 101 as a prerequisite. None of these 4 courses at the bottom depend on one another, though. So consequently, once you've completed Temporal 102, you can choose which of these courses to take according to your needs and interests, and you can take them in any order you like. That said, it's natural to wonder whether there's some optimal order in which to take them. I'd say that if you plan to use Temporal Cloud or just want to see what it looks like, I'd follow Temporal 102 with the Introduction to Temporal Cloud course. Otherwise, I'd skip that and head directly to versioning workflows, since what you just learned in Temporal 102 will be especially helpful for understanding this very important topic. From there, I'd continue on with interacting with workflows, and that's going to open up more of Temporal's core APIs that you'll use to build applications. Once you finish that, I recommend capping it off with securing application data, where you're going to learn about custom data converters and codec servers and the role that they play in protecting confidential information. Okay, that wraps up the section on training courses. I'm going to turn it back over to Angela for something that I think could help your friends and family understand the basics of Temporal.
Thanks, Tom. The Temporal Education team recently collaborated with the design team to bring about a series of comics that explain how Temporal works from a high level. The comics answer questions like, why is durable execution important? What can it be used for, etc. The comics work great for someone just starting out with Temporal or someone without a technical background. To access designs, just go on the Learn site again, and you'll see them in the left-hand side menu. Now we'll talk about our available code samples. Take it away, Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks, Angela. Now I want to cover another set of resources which complement the content that you'll find in our documentation and training courses. These are maintained by our SDK engineering team, and they're so useful that I find myself referring back to them almost every day. Within our GitHub organization, you can find repositories with code samples for every SDK. All of them have names that start with samples, so you can just search for that to see the list and then click the one for your preferred SDK. These are complete examples that you can run for yourself, and they demonstrate how to use specific APIs or how to solve a particular need using that SDK. Next slide, please. Yeah. Here's an example of the samples repository. This one's for the Go SDK. Each one of the subdirectories you see here contains a runnable example. While you can usually infer what the sample demonstrates just based on the name alone, the top-level README file lists them by category, and it provides the description for each one. Next up, I want to talk about some ways to learn by engaging with others in the Temporal community. Temporal is open source. There's a lot of benefits to that. Freedom is an obvious one, but I think one that sometimes get overlooked is community. No matter which stage you're at right now as you learn Temporal, there are many others who are at the same place. There's also people who are now a little further along, and they give back by sharing what they've learned. And as you learn, you have the opportunity to share your knowledge with others too. To help foster that collaboration, you can find a wealth of resources for the Temporal community all in one place. I'll cover these in just a moment, but it all begins by going to the Temporal homepage, pointing to the Resources menu, and clicking the Community link. And this is the page you'll see. You can enter your email address in the box and click the button to join our mailing list. There are also some other icons below that, as well as some other links a little further down the page. I'm going to cover those things now. The first one is our Slack workspace. Aside from GitHub, I think Slack is probably the single most important resource in the Temporal community. There are nearly 13,000 members, and you can interact with them in a variety of topic-specific channels, according to your interests. Even just lurking in these channels is a great way to learn things. It has certainly been, and it continues to be, essential for my own learning of Temporal. There are around 50 active channels right now, and I recommend at least 8 of them to every developer. When you first join our Slack workspace, drop into the Introduce Yourself channel to say hello, perhaps mention a little bit about yourself. I think there's a 99% chance that Maxime Fative, Temporal CTO and co-founder, will reply with an emoji waving to you. I assure you, this is not a bot. He's very active in Slack, as are many of our engineers, product managers, and members of our support team. The announcement channel, as the name suggests, is where we often announce new features and major events. It's relatively low volume, perhaps averaging about 5 messages per month. Just yesterday, we announced work on an official Ruby SDK there. The Ask AI channel is similar to the Ask AI feature I described in our documentation site. You can ask a question and a bot will do its best to provide an answer. This is a really popular channel, and there are usually more than a dozen posts in there every day, so you might consider disabling notifications for this one. The Newbie Temporal Questions channel is very helpful when you're new and you're not sure which channel is best to ask your question. The Operations channel is the best place to be if you're installing and operating a self-hosted deployment of the Temporal server software. The Support channel is where you can get help from others in the Temporal community, which often includes some key people from our own support team. There's also a Go SDK channel, which, as you would expect, is where you're going to find discussions about the Go SDK. There's a similar channel for every other SDK we offer, each following the same naming convention. So there's Java-SDK, Python-SDK, Ruby-SDK, and so on. Finally, the Show Us What You've Got channel is where you can let others know what you've built with Temporal. You'll see some really cool things there, not just links to GitHub repos, but also presentations that people have given and articles that they've written. On the community page, there's a link labeled Forum. This points to community.temporal.io, which uses the Discourse software to provide a searchable, threaded discussion list that's an alternative to Slack. While messages on Slack disappear after 90 days, the one on this site do not, which makes it a better choice for longer technical discussions. These are organized into a handful of categories, similar to Slack channels, and they support the use of tags to identify specific topic areas, such as best practices or Kubernetes. The site has excellent search capabilities too. The advanced search feature allows you to filter by user, by category, by tag, and by date range. You can also sort the results by relevance, date, and the number of likes, which will quickly help you to find the posts that other people have found particularly valuable. Our YouTube channel is the main source of information about video-based content on Temporal, such as recording presentations from past meetups and webinars. And if you weren't able to attend Replay last year, you can catch up by watching the talks that we've posted here. I was at Replay, so I'm glad the talks that are posted to our YouTube channel because they're there and I can watch them anytime I want. There's a lot of times where there are often 2 great talks happening at the same time slot. So this lets me catch up when I got back home. 2 other things that you'll find on our channel are videos that discuss customer use cases and demonstrations of new Temporal features. If you're on LinkedIn, you can follow us there to hear the latest news and events. And speaking of events, this is where you can find out all the upcoming events where Temporal has a presence. So check here to see if there's one convenient to you. If you're going to a conference listed here, be sure to stop by the booth and say hi. I'm sure we'll have some great swag to share with you. And over on the right, you can see a list of cities where there are local Temporal meetup groups. If you live in or near one of these places or just plan to visit, consider joining the group. You'll get to meet other members of the Temporal community in person, possibly even an engineer who wrote some of the code that you use every day. I'll mention one more link on the community page. It's labeled On Demand, and it points to a list of our most popular webinars. If you weren't able to catch them live, this is the way that you can watch the recordings later and get caught up. And that just about wraps it up. Let's take a moment to look back at what we covered, and then we'll move into QA. We started off with Temporal's extensive documentation, covered the Ask AI feature, and then made a detour into the API documentation published by our SDK engineers. From there, we headed over to learn.temporal.io, where we started off with the Getting Started tutorials and then moved on to the more advanced project-based tutorials. Alex and Angela then explained 5 hands-on training courses, while I summarized the Introduction to Temporal Cloud course, and then recommended the order in which to take them. And by the way, in case it wasn't clear, Temporal offers every single one of those courses for free. It's a big investment in the community and something I'm truly grateful for. I'm also very honored by all the positive feedback we've gotten from the people who've taken these courses, letting us know how it's helped them. Another thing we get positive feedback on is the zine, which Angela covered. I then explained where to find SDK code samples, and then I covered a variety of community resources, including Slack, Discourse, and our YouTube channel. On behalf of all four of us, I want to thank you for your time and attention. And what better way to say thank you than with a gift? Next slide. Yeah, thanks. We've got some special Temporal Summer Camp swag. We'll send it to you for free. All you have to do is scan this QR code and use the password SummerCamp24. I'll pause here for a moment so you'll have time to do this. Okay, that should do it. There's just one more thing to do before we move into QA. And that is to bring up the replay slide again, in case you didn't get a chance to scan that QR code earlier. As I mentioned before, tickets are selling quickly, but there's still some left, and we want to offer you a 20% discount as another thank you for attending this session. Just enter the promo code webinar20 when you check out, and you'll get the discount. All right, that should do it. I see that we've got some questions, so let's move into Q&A now. I'll ask the questions and look for Angela and Alex to raise their hand to help and answer some of these. So bear with me for just a moment. Okay, there are quite a few questions here. The first one is, and I'll answer this one. Is the architecture of Temporal built as SaaS only, or is an on-premises option available for enterprise customers who have regulatory requirements regarding data? So the answer is Temporal is open source. That applies to both the server-side software and the SDK, which is the client-side software that you use to build your application. Both of those are open source, and you can run a Temporal service yourself. You can run it on your own machine. By the way, it's under the MIT license, which is one of the most liberal open source licenses there is. So there's no restriction on your ability to run it commercially. There's no limit on the number of machines you can run it on. You can deploy it on a single machine, on a dozen machines, on 100 machines. You can deploy it on bare metal in a virtual machine, on a cloud provider. You can put it in a container and orchestrate it through Kubernetes. You have a lot of flexibility in what you do. So you absolutely can run it yourself. And there's lots of users who do that. A lot of people, though, they don't want to be in the administration game. You know, developers, and I'm a developer myself. I spent a lot of my career as a software engineer, and the last thing I want to do is get paged at 3 a.m. when the disk fills up with log files or something. So I'm perfectly happy to offload the operational aspect of something to other people, to another team, or to another company. And so Temporal Cloud is an alternative to self-hosting. It's a way that you can get the benefits of the Temporal service without actually having to run it yourself. So you can start out running it yourself on your own machines, and at some point you may decide, well, I am growing beyond the capacity of the machines that I have in my data center, and I just want to migrate to Temporal Cloud. You can do that. You can start out with running it locally, then migrate to Temporal Cloud. And if you decide you don't like Temporal Cloud for whatever reason, you can migrate back the other way. You don't have to rewrite your application in order to do this migration. It's simply a matter, in the vast majority of cases, it's simply a matter of configuring some client connection parameters. It would be, to make an analogy, it would be like if you're using ODBC or JDBC to connect to a database from your application, and you want to switch from a database that's running on one machine to a database that's running on a different machine. You change a few connection parameters related to authentication and the host name and the port number, and then that's basically it. Now, that's all you have to do in your code. There is another aspect of migration, which is if you currently have workflow executions that are running, how do you transfer those to the new system? And that part is a little more involved, and it depends on the specifics of your application and so on. But the point I want to make is that it's not a situation where you have to rewrite your entire application in order to migrate from the deployment that's running on your laptop to a deployment that's running in your data center to the deployment that's running in Temporal Cloud. It's pretty easy to migrate the code from one to another and then back again. Okay, so next question. What are some common mistakes to avoid when beginning with Temporal? Angela or Alex, do you have opinions on that?
Yeah, I think one common mistake would be ignoring Temporal's event history limits. New users might overlook the importance of managing your history size, and that can result in performance issues. So you want to avoid creating workflows that generate an excessive number of events. Due to, like I said, it can result in those performance issues. Instead, we recommend you look at the documentation that covers something called continuous new, because what that does is it resets the workflow history. When so in order so because of that, that's a really good option to handle your long running workflow executions, because you can avoid running into that this way.
All right, Alex.
And I would add to that, just making sure that you're thinking about your hosting and your deployment environment. We provide a lot of ways to get up and running. First, in a development server that you can run via our CLI client. From there, you can go to your own deployment using our server binaries. And from there, you should start seriously considering Temporal Cloud. We try to provide a number of steps that people can take as they're ramping up. And we're always happy to have conversations about scaling and deployment as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so another one is, what are some common challenges faced when trying to debug workflows? What do you think?
One would be managing non-determinism. So determinism is a really important concept that basically says same input, same output. And that's really important for the concept of replaying your workflow executions. So non-deterministic code can come from like random number generators, system time, and these can cause workflow executions to result in non-determinism errors, because if you have a random number generator, for example, run the first time, and then when you replay it, that can result in a different output. And so because of that, we require your workflows to be non-deterministic. And you can learn more about the idea of non-determinism, common sources of non-determinism, how to get around it in our Temporal 102 course.
And I'll just add that in the Temporal 102 course, there's a chapter kind of in the middle that provides 4 demonstrations of common problems and how to debug and resolve those. And so one of them that comes to mind, something that frustrated me in the beginning when I was first learning Temporal, is that there's a few things that you've got to run. You've got to run some code that'll start your workflow, and then you also have to have some code that will initialize your worker and have it begin pulling the task queue, looking for work to perform. And a lot of times, because I was new to this, I forgot to run the worker. And so I would start the workflow, but nothing would happen. And I would have 2 events in the history, and I would sit there thinking, what have I done? Why is this not working? And so the very awesome web UI that we have, the design team, they recognize that as a problem. And so they updated the web UI to now show a big yellow message that says you have 0 workers running. So it's harder to make that mistake than it used to be. Or if you do make that mistake, it's more obvious what the problem is. But there's still a problem in that because of the way Temporal is designed, the workers contact the server. The server doesn't know anything about the workers necessarily. It only knows like who's pulled recently, but there's not a centralized registration of all the workers. And consequently, the way that the web UI gets its information about how many workers are running, it's based on which workers have pulled in the last 5 minutes. So in a development cycle, you can get into a situation where you start up a worker, then you see a problem with the code, or you want to update something in the code, so you stop the worker, then you start the worker, then you make another change and you stop the worker, start it back up again. And each one of those, if you do it quickly enough, is going to appear like there's an active worker running at that moment. And so that's a point that I make in the demo, that we make in the demos for Temporal 102, is that the number of workers that it shows you there is not necessarily the number that's running right now. It's the number that has pulled within the last 5 minutes, which it could be the case that there are 0 workers running at a given point in time. Okay, so another question that we have is, will there be a free tier for Temporal Cloud in the future? If so, when? And I will head this one off. I'll say, like, none of us are on the product team, and so that's really a question for the product team, and the product team will probably chase me if I attempt to answer this, but I will say there is currently no free tier for Temporal Cloud. It's something that we have discussed, and I can say that there's absolutely interest in doing it. The challenge is having a free tier while still maintaining a system that is not overrun with abuse. Because if you have a free tier, then people can sign up and use it and like do Bitcoin mining and all sorts of things that are not legitimate uses. So making it useful for people, that is a challenge. But if cost is a factor, we do have a program called Temporal for Startups. And if you go to our homepage and you look at the top, I believe there's a link, and it gives you a credit. I want to say it's $2,400. So it's a credit for $2,400 against your spending on Temporal Cloud. So if you're a startup and you don't have much money as a company, then you can begin using Temporal Cloud that way. Of course, you can also self-host the Temporal service on your own. But if you want to use Temporal Cloud specifically, I'd recommend looking into the startup program. Hey, another question. Do you have any upcoming courses you're developing? Angela,
Yes, we
Alex?
have. Yes, we have an crafting an error handling strategy course coming your way in a few months. We're wrapping up the course right now, and we'll deliver it live at replay. So if you want to get a sneak peek, then that's the best way to do it. And it'll be coming out in, once again, the Go, Java, Python, and TypeScript SDKs.
Yeah, and I'll just add on that replay, as I had said in the beginning, it's such a great way to interact with other people in the Temporal community. But in terms of courses, that's a place where we often debut courses. So when I created the Temporal 101 course, which is the first training course we had on Temporal, I debuted that at the first replay conference in Seattle 2 years ago. And then last year, we taught workshops. I taught 101 and 102 in Go, and Angela taught 101 in TypeScript, and we had some other instructors. Alex had just joined the company, so he observed but didn't teach yet, but we had other people on the team who taught the other courses. So we were teaching many of those for the first time live. And that's going to be the case for replay this year because we have a Beyond the Basics tracks that covers a little bit more advanced stuff. And that's going to consist of the interacting with workflows content that Angela described, and then the crafting and error handling strategy that she just mentioned here. So we'll be debuting that second course live for the first time at replay.
And just to add on to what Tom said, I realized I didn't really describe the course. So this course will basically teach you about error handling, how to configure retries and timeouts, what is idempotency, how do you create activities that are idempotent, and so on.
All right. Another question that's come up here is, what would be the recommendation to use Temporal as an orchestrator for a microservices architecture? We're thinking of using it to orchestrate the microservices calls for business workflows. I'll try to answer that, and then Alex and Angela have something to add, then they can. It's kind of a vague question, so it's hard to say like what the recommendations would be, because those would depend on the specific circumstances of what you're trying to do. But I'll just say that Temporal is a great solution for that specific problem in general. The predecessor of Temporal was a system called Cadence, and it was developed by our co-founders when they were engineers at Uber. Uber had just moved to a microservices architecture, and so the problems that you likely have where you need orchestration for these microservices calls, those were the problems that this system was designed to solve. And doing microservices orchestration is a very, very common use case for Temporal. So the basic idea is in your workflow, you have a sequence of steps that you want to achieve. Many of those steps involve microservices calls. You would perform those in activities, and then that way they get the automatic benefits of retries, timeouts, error handling, that kind of stuff. And so your workflow function just defines what you want to call. The activity functions define the code to actually implement that call. And it's pretty straightforward to set that up for microservices orchestration. Anything else to add, Angela or Alex?
That was a great answer. Nothing to add there.
Okay, great. And so, let's see. so many questions. I'm trying to pick just the very best ones here. And I think we probably have time for one more question here. In addition to the web UI, can error metadata be emitted to outside services for event-driven error alerting and response? Okay, Alex.
It sure can. So on our documentation, we have some examples of connecting to Prometheus, Grafana. We have a few different visibility solutions that you can wire Temporal up to. Monitoring, let's see, we use StatsD and M3 as well, just checking that right now. We're actually trying to expand our use of supported example cases here over the coming months. So by all means, take a look at our docs and check back soon to see if we've provided even more detail there. Good question.
Yeah. Okay, I think that about wraps it up. I think we're just about out of time, so I'll hand it back over to Kelly. And thank you all again for your time and attention.